Well, with the prospects of a new international climate change treaty later this year, Australia's coal industry is facing serious questions about its ability to adapt to the coming shift to a low-carbon world economy. Australia is especially vulnerable because coal is our biggest export earner, and as a nation we're more dependent on burning coal to generate electricity than most. Well, currently the industry is trying to win more concessions from the federal government's proposed emissions trading scheme. In a moment we'll debate what the future holds for that industry. First, Margot O'Neill outlines some of the key challenges.
If you thought Australia's coal industry might downsize because of the international push to slash carbon pollution, think again. Right now, the federal, New South Wales and Queensland governments have committed more than $10 billion for improvements like upgrading rail and port facilities to help the industry double coal exports by 2030.
About half the world's population who don't yet have access to a humble electric light bulb, and obviously as electrification is introduced across Africa, to the 800 million people in China who don't yet have electricity at home, India, clearly demand is going to increase.
Australia's high quality, cheap and accessible coal will remain in hot demand, the industry says. It's our biggest export, worth $46 billion last year, and the industry claims it generates 130,000 Australian jobs. As well, coal provides 85% of Australia's energy relatively cheaply. It's a tap that won't be turned off anytime soon, says the industry.
Australia didn't grow up on the back on the sheep's back. It grew up on the coal conveyor belt. We are a mineral economy.
Which is why the industry is fighting tooth and nail to extract more concessions from the government's proposed emissions trading scheme. And that's not the only challenge facing the coal industry. It's under sustained attack from green groups and high-profile scientists like NASA's James Hansen, a leading climate change expert, who's declared that coal is the single greatest threat to civilisation and who's labelled coal-fired power stations factories of death. Dr Hansen, along with former US Vice President Al Gore, have called for civil disobedience against building any more. Activists in Australia and elsewhere have responded. Recently, 6 of Australia's most senior climate change scientists also wrote to coal companies urging that Australia's coal-fired power stations be shut down as soon as possible. The industry says it accepts the need to fight climate change and it's committed $100 million a year to develop clean coal technology that captures carbon emissions and stores them underground, known as CCS.
Those who are concerned about the environment quite rightly recognise that we need to control and ultimately eliminate our CO2 footprint. How are we going to do that? We're not going to do that by stopping the use of coal, even in the next 20 years. It simply isn't realistic because it just turns off our economy, and it's not going to happen anywhere else in the world either. What we have to focus on is how we control the emissions from the burning of coal.
But clean coal power remains unproven. And even though the industry says its future depends on it, its commitment adds up to just 0.3% of its total revenue, according to climate scientist Ben McNeill. Most of the money for CCS is coming from the taxpayer.
With such a smaller investment in CCS technology, you have to ask the question, is the industry serious about this issue?
The plan to double coal exports could make Australia the single largest exporter of carbon emissions in the world, says author Guy Pearce.
It's essentially the dope dealer's defence that it's the user's responsibility and that the dope dealer doesn't carry any responsibility. And I think ultimately, we have an obligation not just to the world but also to future generations of Australians not to leave their country as a very conspicuous carbon mule in the year 2030, while we pledge to be a much bigger contributor to the fight against climate change.
There's already an emerging shift away from coal power in parts of the developed world. 97 coal-fired power stations have been rejected in the United States in the past 8 years, while the British government has decreed no new coal stations can be built without proven carbon capture and storage.
And they've seen a big shift towards gas and renewables that don't have the problems of carbon pollution. In Australia, we're seeing the exact same thing. 93% of the planned projects in Australia are gas and renewables. They're not coal.
But that's just not enough megawatts to power the Australian economy, says the industry.
Australia will see the building of new coal-fired power stations, but presumably they will be coal-fired power stations that are carbon capture and storage ready.
But new research in Nature magazine concludes that the world can only burn 1/4 of existing fossil fuel reserves for the rest of this century if it's to have a 50-50 chance of preventing dangerous warming of more than 2 degrees.
Yeah, this research suggests that Australia's proven reserves of around 80 billion tonnes, that we'll only be able to use about 20 billion. So it shows that without carbon capture and storage, many of our investments in using these reserves are very high risk, if not worthless. Their balance sheets are going to be highly exposed as many of the banks were to the subprime risk. So it's a subprime risk, if you like.
There's even the possibility of an international move to restrict coal mining around the world, according to Ernst & Young's global leader on climate change.
Something that basically sets perhaps a cap on global coal mining and use of coal for energy.
Without proven carbon capture and storage, it may be financial markets, not protesters, that pose the greatest threat to the long-term future of the coal industry. Margot O'Neill, Lateline.